until 17th century, it was considered that the Gospel of Matthew was written first. And this awareness is very evident among the church fathers. And we have the first witness coming from Papias, the Bishop of Hierapolis, around 125 AD, and whose writing is preserved in the writings of uh, uh, in the history of church, the church history. And there, Papias says that the Gospel of Matthew is written first. Then, using the Gospel of Matthew, Mark wrote the Gospel, and then the Luke's Gospel is written, and then John's Gospel is written. So, according to this view, Gospel of Mark is written after the Gospel of Matthew. But in the 18th century, we have the historical critical method applied into the biblical studies. The method which was used among the secular literature. So that was used for biblical studies, and it was found out that Gospel of Mark is older than the Gospel of Matthew, and we have a lot of reasons for this. Among them, if we read the Gospel of Matthew, almost 80% of this Gospel is a reproduction of the Gospel of Mark. So, in the Greek version, the Greek original, Mark contains 678 verses, of which 80% of Mark is present in Matthew, and 65% of Mark is present in Luke. Then this would mean that the Gospel of Mark was used both by Matthew and Luke as their source. And we have this document hypothesis or documentary hypothesis regarding the synoptic gospels. According to the four document hypothesis, Mark was taken by or used by Luke and Matthew as one of their sources, together with the Q source, the Quelle source, and the special Matthew and special Luke sources. So I don't go into details since we have very less time here. I hope that you hear me well, right? Okay. Then, if we read the Gospel of Mark together with the other two synoptic Gospels, we have less theological development in the Gospel of Mark. For example, if we take the confession of Peter in the Caesarea Philippi, which we have in Mark 8:29, there Peter replies to the question of Jesus, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter replies, "You are the Christ." In Luke, we have the answer, "You are the Christ of God." But in Matthew, we have, "You are Christ, the Son of the living God." So in Matthew, we find the most developed concept. You are the Christ, Son of the living God. And we have also in Luke, we have Christ of God. That means here the divine sonship of Jesus is proclaimed by both Matthew and Luke. But in Mark, we have just "You are Christ." So Jesus is spoken out by Peter or accepted by Peter as Christ, but he doesn't have that Son of God concept. And that is, so we will come to the content of the gospel later. So this proclamation will be found towards the end of the gospel by a human agent. Otherwise, we have the baptism of Jesus and we have the transfiguration. We have this divine proclamation coming from heaven. The Father accept that Jesus is his own Son. But no human agents would be proclaiming Jesus as Son of God, except in chapter 14 at the crucifixion scene. So also in the Gospel of Mark, if we look into the theological terms used, we have a lesser number. For example, the word "kurios," kurios would mean Lord, which is used in the Old Testament for Yahweh, Adonai. This term is less used in Mark in comparison with Matthew and Luke. And we have several other things which I will add in between the class. So all these things would show that the Gospel of Mark is older than Matthew and Luke. Another reason would be the structure of the Gospels. So in Mark we have the structure. We have the beginning of the Gospel in verse 1. Then from chapter 1 verse 2 onwards we have the John the Baptist preaching. Then from verse 12 to 13, then we have Jesus' temptation, and then the public ministry of Jesus. So the public ministry first, it is given in Galilee. Then Jesus is traveling towards Jerusalem, and finally he reaches Jerusalem, and he undergoes passion and death, and we have the resurrection. So this is the structure of the Gospel of Mark, which is copied by Luke and Matthew. So almost they copy the structure of the Gospel of Mark. So when we have some disagreement between Mark and Luke with regard to the structure which is found in Mark, Matthew would be agreeing with Mark. So when we have some disagreement between Matthew and Mark, then in those passages, Luke will be agreeing with Mark. That means Mark can be seen or taken as the middle term when we study the synoptic gospels. So that means it is the structure of the Mark and it is the content of the Mark which guides or controls the structure and the content of the gospels of Matthew and Luke. So all these things would prove that the gospel of Mark is older to Matthew and Luke. And also the Greek language used in the gospel of Mark is less sophisticated in comparison with Matthew and Luke. So Mark uses the conjunction. In Greek it is kai, and so it is used many times whenever it is necessary and unnecessarily also. But when we come to the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, so they would transform this kai into other conjunctions like un or they or gar. So they have different better techniques. So they refine the language of the Gospel of Mark whenever they take something from Mark. So all these things would prove that the Gospel of Mark is older to Matthew and Luke. Then coming to the Gospel and its genre, so the literary type. So we know that we call it as Gospel. So what is a Gospel? This is an ancient literary form to describe the life of a person. So in the Greek language, we have the literary genre called bios or bioi, the biography. So this gospel is basically composed after the model of Greco-Roman biographies. And the biography which we have in the modern age is somewhat different from the ancient biographies or Greco-Roman biographies, because today we think about a biography, it will give us accurate dates, the persons, the facts, etc. So a biography would try to picture a person systematically, scientifically, and with scientific details like date, place, time, etc. But when we come to the Greco-Roman biographies, they are different from the modern biographies. So it would be using the sources about a person. That means it can be oral sources or written sources, and they will make use of the sources regarding the sayings, speeches, anecdotes, conflict stories, or the miracles, or important events from the life of that person. So all these things would be gathered together and put together to picture the person. So the purpose of such a bios or a BOI, the biographies would be to inspire the contemporary people. So it would be mostly presenting the positives of the life of the persons. So it would be for motivating them, inspiring the audience to give them. So you are asking me something? Okay, okay. Okay, then you can just mute the mic. Thank you. Okay, so this is composed after the model of the ancient Greek or Roman biographies. So that is about this literary genre. And in this biography itself, we can find different the other sub literary types like uh, stories, anecdotes, or parables, or miracles, etc. So all these things we can find in the Gospel of Mark. Then, who is the author of this Gospel? So this Gospel doesn't record about its author. So the author doesn't name himself in this Gospel. And according to the church tradition, the early Christian tradition, the person called Mark or John Mark is the author of this Gospel. And who was he? If we go to the Acts of the Apostles, we have a few references regarding Mark. So, especially in chapter 12, verse 12 in the Acts of the Apostles, we can find the mother of Mark is mentioned there. Her name was Mary, and who had a house in Jerusalem. And this was a meeting place for the believers, the first Christians. And in chapter 12, verse 25, we have the reference that when Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch from Jerusalem, so Mark accompanied them. So he was a collaborator of Paul and Barnabas. But later, uh, when they were at Perga in Pamphylia, then Mark departed from them and returned to Jerusalem. And this we can find in Acts chapter 13:13. And Paul didn't want him to return. So he wanted to have Mark accompany him. So Mark's return somehow disappointed Paul. And he had a kind of ill feeling regarding Mark. That is why we have in Acts chapter 15, verse 36 to 39. So we have this broken relationship is pictured. So there, Barnabas wanted to take Mark together with them, but Paul opposed. So Barnabas took Mark, and Paul departed from them, and he traveled by his own. So we can find it. And in the letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verse 1, we can find that Mark was a cousin of Barnabas himself. And again, at the later stage of Paul's life, we can find that there was a reconciliation between Paul and Mark. So there, especially, we have in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11, we have Paul writing to Timothy to send Mark to Rome to be with him during his final imprisonment because he would be useful for him for the service. And later, in letter to the Philemon, verse 24, we can find that Mark was with Paul during his imprisonment in Rome. So somehow Mark reached Paul and he was helping him. And again, 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13 gives us a hint that Mark was with Peter when Peter wrote this letter. So Mark was taken to be Peter's spiritual son. And now we have the key to the concept where from Mark got his understanding of Jesus. We do not know whether he was one among the disciples of Jesus, like the 70 which we find in Luke. But anyway, according to the early Christian tradition and the church fathers, Mark inherited his knowledge about Christ from Apostle Peter. and also he might have received some information from Paul and Barnabas or other early Christians. But basically, it is coming from Peter. So the church tradition was that from Papias, Paul shared his Christ experience to Mark and he put it to writing. So Mark composed his gospel probably in Rome. So this was considered to be a gospel written for the Christians who converted into Christianity from pagan religions other than the Jewish Christians. So we can find a kind of openness to the Gentile population in the Gospel of Mark in comparison with Matthew. Okay, coming to the period of its composition. So we do not know exactly when this gospel was written, and there are different theories regarding its composition. Some theories gives an early date like 50s, and some theories gives a later date like 90s, and more accepted theory is that the gospel is written around the end of 60s, just before the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, which happened around AD 70. So this gospel was written maybe probably during the religious persecution of the Roman emperor Caesar Nero, who ruled Rome between AD 54 and 68. So it was in 68 that Nero, Emperor Caesar Nero, passed away, and before his death, this gospel might have been written, because we have a kind of persecution. So Jesus's trial, death, and resurrection is given a lot of importance in the Gospel of Mark. So the the whole content of the Gospel is pointing towards the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And this would mean that the Gospel was written in a period when the Christians were persecuted, and in order to strengthen them, this Gospel was written. And regarding the place of writing, I have told you that the most accepted candidate regarding the place is Rome, but there are also some argue for the Palestinian origin of this gospel, or the Syrian or Antiochian origin of this gospel. Antiochia was a place in Syria, the present day Syria. So there are also such differing views regarding the place of origin regarding this gospel. Then, coming to the structure of the gospel, so this gospel has a short introduction in chapter 1, verse 1 to 15. Then we have the first part of this gospel after the introduction, chapter 1, verse 16 to chapter 6, verse 6a, the ministry in Galilee. So this is the first part of the gospel after the introduction. Then we have the middle part from chapter 6, verse 6b to chapter 10, verse 52. And this records Jesus' travel to Jerusalem. So during this travel, what he did untaught. This is composed in this part from chapter 6 to 10. Then we have in chapter 11 1 to 13 37, we have Jesus doing his ministry in Jerusalem. Then we have the conclusion in chapter 14, verse 1 to chapter 16, verse 20. There we have the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So this is the structure of the gospel. So we have the introduction in chapter 1, verse 1 to 15. Then we have the first part, chapter 116 to 6a, the ministry in Galilee. So we have the second part, 6b to 1052, travel to Jerusalem. And the third part, we have chapter 11 1 to 13 37, ministry in Jerusalem. And we have the conclusion, chapter 14 1 to chapter 16, verse 20. So this is the structure of the gospel. Then coming to its content and its presentation of Jesus. So we can find that the chapter 1, verse 1 gives us the the key to understanding the gospel or the content of the gospel. So the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So with this introductory verse, we have the intention of the evangelist regarding the writing of the gospel is evident. So he is presenting uh, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So Jesus Christ would sound to us like a surname or a proper name. So we have Jesus and Christ, but actually Jesus is a proper name, but Christ is a title. It's not like a surname or something like that. So this is a title, and this word Christ is coming from uh, the Greek Christos, which in turn is coming from the Hebrew Mashiach. So this Hebrew term Mashiach is coming from the verb masha, which means to anoint. So Christ means anointed, and we know that this has got an Old Testament background. So in the Old Testament, uh, that which is set apart for God was always anointed with anointing oil. So an object can be anointed, like the temple. It's the altar in the temple, or the objects or utensils to be used in the temple. So they all were anointed, and anointing uh, meant that that thing, the anointed thing, is set apart for God, and that would never be those things, objects would never be used for the other mundane purposes. And when we come to the persons, so we have the people who are anointed. For example, we have the priests anointed. So we have the description of the anointing of priest in the book of Leviticus. Moses is anointing Aaron and his sons, etc. Or we have the kings being anointed. So we have in the book of Samuel, in the two books of Samuel, we have anointing of Solomon, David, Saul, David, etc. So a person can be anointed like kings or priests. And later, so we have the people coming and living in the land, and with the Babylonian exile, the last king of the Jews who ruled in Judah was exiled to Babylon, and he died there as a captive. And the people were permitted to come back to the land of Israel. Uh, Later, they rebuilt the temple, but they never had a Davidic king again. But in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 to 14, we have a promise given to the house of David. The Lord is promising David that a descendant of David would be ruling over the kingdom forever. So the Lord is going to build a house for David, and his kingdom would never end. So what happened to this kingdom? So the people, they had the puzzle of the Babylonian exile. So the dilemma, after the Jehoiakim, the last king who was exiled into Babylonia, which is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 25. So the kingship in Judea stops. And now the people had the hope. So they began to hope that the Lord's promise given to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 to 14 is going to come. It's going to be fulfilled. So they were eagerly waiting for the fulfillment. And now Mark says, so the long awaited Messiah, the Christos, this is Jesus. So he's presenting him as Christ. And we have different concept about Christ when we come to the first century BC, first century AD Jewish people. So mostly they were waiting to have a political liberator, and especially you might have heard of an apocryphal writing called the Book of Jubilees, which is an Old Testament apocrypha. There we have have the Christ, the anointed one of God. He would come and he will chase away the foreign powers from the land of Israel, and he's going to build his own empire, a, a free nation, and the Jews would be allowed to do their worship freely and without any defect. So that was an example of the first century BC hope regarding the Messiah. But we can also understand from the surrounding culture or the surrounding literature, the contemporary to the New Testament. So we have the Qumran literature, so Qumran writing. So among these writings from Qumran, we have also a concept regarding an Aaronite Messiah. That means the Messiah would be a priest. So this priest, this Messiah priest would establish a true worship, a pure worship, because the Essenes, the Qumran people, they cut away from the mainstream Judaism, which was centered around Jerusalem and its temple and the sacrifices or the temple worship. So they considered the temple worship and the priestly rule in this temple as something abominable. So they separated from the mainstream Judaism and they retreated to the Judean desert, and they have been living there. And they had the expectation of the Messiah coming and purifying the cult in Jerusalem. And these are the examples of different views regarding the Messiah. But now Mark says Jesus is Christ. But what kind of Christ is he? So we have a totally different concept of Messiah pictured in the Gospel of Mark. But this is not something created in vacuum. Rather, this is what the Old Testament, especially the prophet Isaiah, speaks about Christ. So we have all the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels, picturing Jesus as the Messiah in fulfillment of the Isaianic prophecy. That is why in Matthew chapter 11, chapter 1 and the following, we have the disciples of John the Baptist coming and asking Jesus, who are you? Are you the Messiah? Then what does Jesus do? So he is calling the sick people and he is healing them. He healed the deaf, he healed the blind, he healed the lame, and he casted out demons. And he asked the disciples of John the Baptist to go back and tell John uh, about what they have seen and heard. That means Jesus is telling John that John is now is awaiting for a political liberator, because John is in prison. So he has been arrested by Herod Antipas, and he is put in prison. And if John knows that uh, he is the precursor of Messiah, one who has come to prepare the way of the Messiah. But if Jesus is the Messiah, then why should the one who came to minister to Messiah would find himself in prison? So John is troubled by the dilemma. So that is why John had the doubt. And now Jesus says, no, your doubt is in vain, because you are not having a concept of Messiah in accordance with the scripture. So he is asking him to have a true version of the messianic hope coming from Isaiah chapter 42. That's why he is doing this miracle and informing John. And now the Gospel of Mark also would be presenting the Messiah in this line. So we have after the title, Jesus is presented as Son of God, and we know that this gospel is proclaimed to a community, and the author knows what he writes, and the hearer of the proclamation or reader of this gospel, they also know the world of the writer. But the characters in this gospel story, like the disciples, the people who were healed, or the different other characters appearing here who appear in this gospel narrative, they do not know about Jesus. And this would be gradually revealed to everyone. So we have in this gospel a gradual revelation of the personality of Jesus or the identity of Jesus. So many a time we will find Jesus being doubted by the disciples. Sometime we have Jesus showing human emotions. Sometimes we have the disciples having misunderstanding of Jesus. So we have sometimes the Jesus or trying to kill him. So we have the Satan who proclaim or who want who cry out uh, about the identity of Jesus, etc. So this messianic secrecy is kept all throughout the gospel, and it is something which is gradually revealed. And this final, the climax of this revelation would happen at the foot of the cross. So until then, the messianic mystery would be hidden somewhat from even from the disciples. So Jesus, as Son of God, would be revealed later. So the whole gospel is a narration of how Jesus is revealed to be the Son of God. So how and why and when Jesus is revealed to be the Son of God. So this is the whole content of this gospel. And again, so we have the 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 beginning of the gospel, the first part in the gospel. So we have in the introductory part, we have the John the Baptist appearing. And this appearing of John the Baptist is in accordance with the prophetic promises given in the prophet Malachi chapter 3 verse 1. So before the Messiah, uh, Elijah would be sent. So who was this Elijah? So we have in Second King chapter 1 uh, and and the following we have the picture of the prophet Elijah, and we know that he didn't die. So he was taken boldly into heaven. So he ascended into heaven. So that is what we know about Elijah from the scriptures. And the Jewish people, they believed that Elijah would come back to prepare the path of the Messiah. So Elijah would be sent in preparation of the arrival of the Messiah. And now Mark is presenting John the Baptist as the expected Elijah. So Elijah who was to come. And we have the evangelist presenting John as the Elijah, like explaining his dress, his diet, all these things we can find. Elijah had the diet, the peculiar diet. It is mentioned in Second King chapter 1 verse 8. And uh, this picture of John proves that the evangelist is presenting him as the Elijah who had to come, who would come to prepare the path of the Messiah. And just after the baptism from John the Baptist, so Jesus is led into the desert to be tempted. So we have the temptation of Jesus in just two verses, chapter 1 verse 12 and verse 13. So there Mark gives the shortest description of the temptation of Jesus. And he says that he writes that Jesus was helped by angels. So he has been with he has been in the wilderness together with the beast, the wild animals, and the angels ministered to him. So the presence of angels here reveals that this is something, someone extraordinary, a godly person. And also we have during the baptism we have this so the voice from heaven: "You are my beloved son." So verse 11, chapter 1, verse 11. So this voice is different from the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, or Matthew, Luke, or John. So in all other Gospels, the divine voice, the voice from heaven, is for John and the people standing nearby. It was not for Jesus. But in the Gospel of Mark, the voice is addressed to Jesus. So it is Jesus who hears the voice. You are the my beloved son. With you I am well pleased. So the voice is addressed to Jesus. So it is Jesus who hears the heavenly voice. So here the divine sonship of Jesus is probably revealed to Jesus alone according to the Gospel of Mark, in difference from the other Gospels. So this the divine sonship is somehow kept secret for the others, including John the Baptist or the disciples, and it would be gradually revealed to them through a process in the gospel. So we, the readers or the listeners of this gospel, we are the omniscient readers or listeners. So we know what is going on here, but in the narrative, the people, they are unaware of it. And we can find that the disciples, they do not understand who Jesus is. So for example, we have the multiplication of the bread in chapter 6, and there the disciples did not understand. Or again chapter 7 verse 18, chapter 8 verse 17 to 18. So we have the disciples not understanding, uncomprehending disciples pictured there. And 652 we have their hearts were hardened. Also 8:17 we have their hearts were hardened. So the disciples failed to understand who Jesus was. So this is the picture we get from the Gospel of Mark. So in comparison with other Gospels, we have a very raw picturization of the disciples. So their negativity is not hidden. But when we come to the Gospel of Matthew, so he will just peel away from his source Mark. When he writes, he would not add, the disciples did not understand Jesus. So he will just take away such sentences. And in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, the disciples were more understanding. So they act according to the wish of Jesus, etc. But here, the disciples are presented with their incapacities, their humanness, their frailties, and their failures. Also, we have the picture of the disciples. So the disciples are having a kind of revelation of Jesus from the mid of the gospel. So in 8 verse 29, we have Jesus asking the disciples, who am I? So who do you say I am? So there Peter is replying, you are Christ. So now we have the disciples having a kind of understanding about Jesus himself. And these disciples were chosen by Jesus, and he has formed them into a group. So why did Jesus uh, call the disciples? Because this was the messianic duty of Jesus. So the Messiah, when he comes, he has to form a people. So Messiah would establish a kingdom and a reign. So the preliminary element of the constitution of his reign is to form a people. And that is why Jesus is calling the 12 disciples. And we have the disciples responding to the call of Jesus. So they leave everything and immediately they follow Jesus. So they give a very positive response to Jesus's call. So they follow him. So following Jesus would mean that they have to follow Jesus in his patterns of life, in his behavior, in his words, in his deeds, in his attitude. So whatever Jesus is. So following Jesus would demand from the disciples a kind of conforming themselves with Jesus. So a disciple should receive the personality of Jesus in his own person. So that is what is meant by following Jesus. And this has got connection with the Old Testament people. So, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, we have in chapter 6, we have the commandments given to the people. And there, the Lord is commanding them, you have to walk my commandments. So, you have to walk. The word used is walk. So, the same, some semantically related verb is used by Jesus. You have to follow me. So, you have to walk. So, walk the commandment. Now, Jesus stands in the place of the commandment. So the disciples have to follow Jesus. So they have to walk along the path of Jesus. So that's what we find the connection between the Old Testament people and the New Testament people. And these people, so they have got a lot of similarity with the Old Testament people. So in the Old Testament, we have the messianic hope. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 16 to 18, the Lord is promising them that he is going to raise a prophet after Moses among his brothers. And the evangelists, all the evangelists would present Jesus as the new Moses, this long awaited new Moses. That is why Jesus is multiplying the bread in the desert. So just as the Old Testament Moses gave the manna to the people, now the New Testament Moses is giving them the manna. And when we come to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is climbing up a hill, and he is sitting there and he is teaching them the commandments. So we have the Sermon on the Mount from chapter 5 to 7. And also in the Gospel of Mark, it's not like in Matthew, but we have the scattered teaching of Jesus given in the Gospel. So Jesus teaches here just as the Old Testament Moses. So he is the new Moses. But this new Moses is much greater than the Old Testament Moses because he is Son of God. He is the Christ. And if we read, if we follow the teaching of the Gospel of Saint John, all the law and prophet, that means Moses and the prophets were preparing for the Messiah, for Jesus, and they taught about Jesus according to the teaching of the Gospel of John. And coming to the Gospel of Mark, we have these disciples just following Jesus, and they let themselves to be formed by Jesus. And especially in chapter 4, when Jesus is teaching them, so he would be using a lot of parables. And the disciples would ask him, why are you teaching us in parable? Chapter 4, verse 10 to 20. And we have Jesus answering them. So you are inside the kingdom. So to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those who are outside, everything comes in parable. So the disciples who are called by Jesus, who follow Jesus, and in chapter 3, verse 13, we have these 12 apostles elected by Jesus. So they are inside. They have been given the mystery of the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus is training them in a special way. So Jesus would be teaching them in private. So Jesus would be teaching the people in parable, and later the meaning of the parable will be revealed to the disciples. So they are a special group. So they are given a special teaching, a special formation. But unfortunately, these disciples, they do not understand who Jesus is in reality. So verse 29, we have Peter confessing Jesus as the Christ. Understanding is very much limited. And we have in Mark chapter 14, verse 51. So we have Jesus after the prayer in Gethsemane, Jesus is arrested. And all disciples. You want to ask me something, Sajida Mary? Sister Sajida?
Yes.
You have a question? Okay,
No,
sister.
Father. No, Father.
Yeah, it's okay. So in chapter 14, verse 51, we have all the disciples. They just deserted Jesus and fled to save their life just after his arrest in Gethsemane. But we have a hope. In verse 51, we have a certain young man following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. But the soldiers tried to catch him, and he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. So we have the last one among the men disciples leaving Jesus. So Jesus has been forming these disciples in a very intimate way. But we have a failed discipleship at the time of persecution, at the time of arrest of Jesus. But still, we have some women following Jesus, especially at the scene of crucifixion. We have a few women standing close by, watching what is happening to Jesus. We have Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, and we have Salome and the other women. So we have a hope. Even though the men disciples deserted Jesus, so we have the women disciples following Jesus. At least they are not deserting him when he was crucified. And after the burial, so it was a Sabbath night. So uh, early morning, when the Sabbath ended, so it was the first day of the week. The Mary Magdalene and the Mary mother of James and Salome, though they brought some spices and they came to the tomb of Jesus to anoint him. And to their surprise, when they reached the tomb was opened, and they have found a man in white garments sitting at the place where Jesus' body was laid. And he told them that Jesus is risen. And uh, he has given them the mission to proclaim to the apostles that Jesus is already risen, and he would go to Galilee in front of ahead of them, and they have to follow him in order to meet him there. And we have in verse 8, uh, they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So, these women who came to Jesus, who proved to be courageous disciples, even at the scene of crucifixion and after the burial, after the funeral, but now they also fail. They fail to announce the resurrection of Jesus to the disciples, and they kept silent. So, as a whole, the gospel is giving us a kind of a failed discipleship. So, if we read the most ancient manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, so we have the gospel ends in chapter 16, verse 8. So, this last final verse 8, would be an awkward ending. So, the women disciples, they fear, and they kept silent, and they didn't proclaim, they didn't speak out of the resurrection of Jesus. So somehow this created an ill feeling among the copiers of the gospel. And in a later stage, verse 9 to 20 were added to this gospel. So the earliest manuscript, we do not have these final verses, but in the current canonical form, we have all these verses. But originally, the gospel was supposed to end in verse 18. So why does Mark stopped the gospel in verse 18, verse 8, 16, verse 8? Because uh, we have all the disciples, including men and women, failed to proclaim or follow Jesus. And now the reader, so we readers or the audience of the gospel, now we are challenged. So the historical disciples of Jesus failed to proclaim him. But can you proclaim Jesus? So through using this narrative technique, the evangelist is provoking us to continue the the evangelization, the proclamation of the gospel. So this is the narrative technique used by the evangelist. And still, when we come to the content of the gospel, I have told you that the evangelist is trying to present Jesus as the Son of God. And as Son of God, Jesus had different responses from the people. So the first few chapters picture Jesus as the authoritative Son of God. So one who is having authority. So it is in chapter 1 verse 22, the people himself would say that he is teaching us with authority. And again, chapter 1 verse 23, so the demon possessed person would say that you are the Holy One of God. And again, chapter 1 verse 27, so he commands with authority. And he heals the sick. So the authority of Jesus is several times it is approved by either the people or the authorities, or even by the demons. And Jesus also shows power over the sick. It can be his relatives or his followers or unknown people. So all throughout chapter 1 we have the portrayal of Jesus having authority of Son of God. And again, Jesus, the Son of God, is opposed vehemently by the Jewish leaders. So we have in chapter 2 1 to chapter 3, verse 6, we have the conflict stories. So Jesus is performing miracles during the Sabbath, and he has been questioned. So he is opposed. The Son of God is opposed there. And they question the actions of Jesus, and they take offense about Jesus's associates, because he is even they take offense of Jesus's disciples, and they take offense at Jesus's activities. And they take the serious exception to his own action, and they try to put him to death. So they desire to put Jesus to death. That is what we find in verse chapter 3 verse 6. So Jesus as the Son of God is opposed very vehemently. And again, we have the Jesus, the opposition to Jesus is getting worse in the later phase in the gospel, especially in chapter 11 and chapter 12. We have Jesus is opposed vehemently. Also, Jesus is misunderstood as a Son of God by the disciples. Also, we have the Beelzebul story. So in chapter 3, the Jewish leaders are they are blaming that Jesus is possessed by Beelzebul, and he is casting out demon by the power of the devil. So Jesus is misunderstood by the people. And also we have the family of Jesus. So they also considered him as out of mind. So, and they come and try to take him away. So Jesus, somehow he is very much opposed. But at the same time, we have also Jesus is accepted as Son of God. So the acknowledgement of Jesus can be found. Especially we have the already we have spoken about Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. So in chapter 8, so there Jesus is confessed to be the Son of God. Also, we have the climactic scene in under the foot of the cross in chapter 15, verse 39. So there, having seen how Jesus dies, so Jesus cries, "My Lord, why have you abandoned me?" So, seeing Jesus' death on the cross, the centurion, so he was a Roman citizen, centurion, not a Jew, a pagan, not a disciple. So he is giving the testimony. So this is truly Son of God. So the proclamation of Jesus as Son of God, the climactic scene we can find under the foot of the cross. So what kind of Messiah is Jesus? So that is what is revealed through these chapters. And the whole gospel was orienting towards this final proclamation regarding Jesus as this Messiah. So he is the suffering Son of God. And especially from chapter 8, we have three times Jesus predicting his passion and death. So from chapter 8 onwards, we have the passion and death of Jesus is given the utmost importance in the gospel. So the suffering Son of Man, the dying Son of Man, the opposite Son of Man. So he is walking towards the cross. So he is traveling from chapter 6 onwards. He is traveling towards Jerusalem. So why does he walk to Jerusalem? In order to be caught, in order to be persecuted and killed on the cross. So the salvific event would happen on the cross, and Jesus is preparing himself for that salvific event. And we know that this is what is in fulfillment of the Isaianic prophecy of the servant of the Lord, servant of Jehovah, in Isaiah chapter 53. So there, Jesus is suffering. And again, chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus himself would say, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many." And he said this in order to teach the disciples. So they have been discussing among themselves who is the greatest. So who is bigger? Who has got more authority? And now Jesus says, no, you have to become first by becoming servants. So why the model is Jesus himself. So he has come not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So here we have the Jewish concept about the forgiveness of sins is redefined. So we have the forgiveness of sins in the Jewish religion came through the celebration of the Day of Atonement, which is mentioned in uh, uh, the book of Leviticus, chapter 16. So, among the Torah, so we have 5 books in the Torah from Genesis all the way up to the book of Deuteronomy. The middle book, the central book is book of Leviticus, and the central part of book of Leviticus is chapter 16, which speaks about the Yom Kippur. So this would mean uh, how much important is the Day of Atonement for the Jewish people, because it is on that day that the high priest offered sacrifices for the nation of Israel. So for Israel as a whole. So there have been a lot of sacrifices in the temple, daily sacrifices to please God or to pray for them. But the forgiveness of sins was happened through the Yom Kippur celebration, the Day of Atonement celebration. And now Jesus says, I have come to give my life as a ransom for many. So it is not the Yom Kippur gods, but Christ Himself, Jesus Himself, who is going to become the ransom for the sins of the people of Israel. And this culminates in the cup saying of Jesus in chapter 14. We have the institution of the Eucharist there. In so we have in verse 24, he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." So we have the blood poured out for many. Actually, this was poured out for many during the Yom Kippur festival in the Temple of Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies. But now, Jesus himself is pouring out his blood for many. And we have the very beautiful scene regarding the death of Jesus. So, what happens at the death of Jesus? Mark would picture that. So, we have at the time of Jesus' death, the, uh, the curtain in the temple tore into two from above to the bottom. So we have chapter 15 verse 38, and the curtain of the temple was torn into two from top to the bottom. And this curtain was something that hid the holy of holies, the most important part in the temple of Jerusalem, from the people. So this was accessible not to all priests but only to the high priest, and even he could enter the holy of holies only once in a year, and that was during the Yom Kippur celebration. And he entered there in order to atone for the sins of himself and his family, and also for the people of Israel. And now, what happens after Jesus' death? So, when Jesus is crucified, his blood is poured out, and his life is poured out. So, at the very moment when Jesus' life is poured out on the cross, the curtain that separated or that hid the holy of holies from the people and from the priests is torn into two, and it is torn from above, from top to the bottom. This would mean that this was a divine action, so initiated by heaven, by God. And this has taken away the separation between human beings and God. So now the holy place is open for everyone. So everyone, it is visible, and everyone can come into God's presence. They can have a love relationship with God. So in Jesus' death, the heaven and earth, they are reconciled. All people's sins were forgiven. So Jesus has atoned. So he has given his life as a ransom for many. And it is at this moment that the centurion proclaims that Jesus is the Messiah. And when we come to the early part of the gospel, so we have Jesus commanding the messianic secrecy. So whenever he does a miracle, so he is telling them not to reveal who he is. So he commands to silent. Uh, he commands the demon to be silent about himself. This we can find in chapter 1, verse 30 to 34, or chapter 3, verse 12. And after healing public miracles, so he is asking them not to make it public. So chapter 1 verse 42 and 45, chapter 5 verse 43, chapter verse 36, then we have chapter 8 verse 26. So here in all these places Jesus is commanding them not to make this miracle public. Also he is teaching the disciples in private, and also Jesus is uh, asking the disciples to be silent. So especially after the resurrection, after the transfiguration in chapter 9, so he is asking them not to tell anyone until he is resurrected. So until resurrection, the disciples are asked to keep silence. So the messianic secrecy is hidden. So why he is asking them to keep this messianic secrecy? There have been a lot of views, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. We have a German scholar called Rede. So he was telling that because historical Jesus never considered himself as the Messiah, and he didn't believe himself to be the Messiah, and uh, the messiahship of Jesus, or the divine sonship of Jesus, was an invention of the early Christians. So we have the historical critical studies, and there was a concept that whatever we find in the gospel is legend or fabricated stories. So there was a period in the 19th century, in order to think everything described in the gospel as the invention of the disciples, or Jesus never had that concept, that never thought himself to be son of God or the Messiah. But we have always in the gospel the awareness of Jesus that he is the uh, divine son. And when we read the gospel, it is hidden from the characters in the gospel, but the writer of the gospel knows it. Also we, the readers, so we know that we have a, uh, uh, we have of the divinity of Jesus. And This is revealed gradually in the gospel, and the concept of the divinity of Jesus reaches its climax on the cross when he dies. So, how Jesus is revealed to be Son of God? By dying a death for others, for the humankind. And now we have the path. So you are also called to divine sonship. So we are all sons and daughters of God. But how our divine sonship is to be revealed, or how should we achieve the divine sonship in our life? So we have received it through our baptism. So, but how we have to actualize it? Already and not yet. Already we are sons and daughters of God, but there is an element of not yet. So how is it to be completed? So through living for others, suffering for others, dying for others. So by following Jesus. So this is following Jesus. So what is the following of Jesus according to the Gospel of Mark? So dying for others, living for others, becoming a ransom for many. So trying to serve others and choose not to be served. So that's the path of discipleship which we find in the Gospel of Mark. So we have the messianic secrecy kept in the Gospel of Mark, and this messianic secrecy is a part of Mark's theology of the cross. So it is in it is upon the cross that the full messiahship of Jesus is revealed to us. Also, we have the function of Mark's irony. So the irony means the contrast. So what do we find on the cross? So in human viewpoint, we have the failure. So if we evaluate life of Jesus in according to the human logic, so he has totally a failed life. So he chose the disciples and he gave them special formation, but all of them left him. And the last disciples, the one who followed him, left, even leaving the his mantle and running away naked. And this person, Jesus, is dying on the cross, totally abandoned. Even we have Jesus had the feeling that even God himself, his father himself, abandoned him. That is why we have the cry of Jesus, uh, my God, why have you abandoned me? So Jesus' life was an utter failure. So this is the human viewpoint, and here we find the irony of Mark, the contrast. But even in this failure, so what is appeared to be a failure in human perspective is actually not a failure. This is a victory. This is a victory in the perspective of God. And we are called to participate in this victory, the divine victory, which on human logic, according to the human logic, which would be very difficult. So according to the Gospel of Mark, the discipleship to Jesus is also a choice, an option. So he is constantly calling us. So we have to examine our ways. And we have the failed discipleship in the Gospel of Mark, as I told you. But at the same time, the Mark is giving us a kind of positive view. For example, we have in chapter uh, 8, we have the Jesus foretelling his death from chapter 8:39 onwards. So we have the first prediction of Jesus, then we have the transfiguration, and uh, we have the last miracle of Jesus, the healing of the blind man in Bartimaeus in chapter 9, verse 46 and the following. Just before that, we have 9:35 onwards. We have James and John asking for the favor to sit at the right hand side and left hand side of Jesus. So they are claiming for the the first two positions. So just before that, what happens? 10:32, Jesus is making the third prophecy, the third time prophecy regarding his crucifixion and death. And now Jesus is teaching them privately, but they failed to understand who Jesus is. So that is why just after the teaching of the cross, James and John are asking for the best positions. So this would mean that the disciples are again and again they are a failure. They fail to understand Jesus, but Jesus is giving them a positive perspective. So what happens in chapter 10, verse 46? There, Jesus has already reached Jericho. He is on his way to Jerusalem, and we have a blind man called Bartimaeus. So Jesus is healing them, and Jesus is healing him with a process. So he is telling him, don't lose heart. So Jesus is touching and healing him. So this would mean that now this Bartimaeus is symbolically reflect the disciples who fail to understand Jesus himself. And Jesus is now, so they are blind, they are not able to see the messianic mystery. So they are incapable to understand this messianic mystery. They are blind. But now, Jesus healing Bartimaeus is giving us a hope and giving them a hope that Jesus would heal them from their ignorance. So, Jesus is inviting them to have the true discipleship. And also, we have uh, in chapter 8, verse 29, we have Peter. So when does Peter is declaring Jesus as Christ? It is in Caesarea Philippi. So Peter is telling, you are Christ. But just after this revelation, this proclamation of Peter, Jesus is continuing to teaching him, teaching the disciples about his death. And what is the response of Peter? So we have it in chapter 8, verse 32. He said this openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So Peter, who proclaimed Jesus as Christ, is now trying to hinder him. So this would mean that Peter has having a totally different perspective regarding Christ, which would go in line with the popular Jewish concept of the Messiah as a political leader who would defeat the invading enemies, that means at present the Romans, and would establish a kingdom, a new kingdom. So Peter is away from the mystery of the cross. And now, what is the response of Jesus? So Jesus is turning back to Peter and telling him, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. So Peter, who rejected the way of the cross, is identified by Jesus as Satan. So if we reject cross and the way of the cross, then we become the followers of Satan, or our ways become satanic. And what is the solution? Solution is given by Jesus himself. So Jesus is asking Peter, get behind me. So get behind Jesus would mean, again, this is equal to follow me. So walk behind Jesus. So walk the same trails of Jesus. So we have no other options but receiving the cross. So in order to become the true disciples of Jesus, we have to understand the mystery of Christ. And that is the teaching of the Gospel of Mark. And we should think that this Gospel is written by the end of 60s, in a time when the Christians were persecuted very severely. So we have the historical, the Roman historians who records about the persecution of the early Christians during the reign of Nero. They were catching Christians and they were tying them to the pillars on the roadside, and they are using them like lampstands. So they would pour out oil upon the Christians, and they would put fire, and they let the Christians stand on the roadside like torches. So such kind of brutal persecutions the Christians have been undergoing at that time. Now Mark is writing his gospel to strengthen the Christians who were being persecuted. So that is why we can find a lot of emphasis given to the suffering and death of Jesus. And the disciples who failed to proclaim Jesus' resurrection. So the death, it didn't stop there. And death finally resulted in the resurrection. So the death led to the resurrection. So there is a kind of glory. So cross is followed by glory in the life of Jesus, and the same would happen also in the life of the disciples. But do you want that glorification in your life? So first you have to take the path of cross. So you have to walk the path of cross. So if you do not carry the cross and walk uh, behind Jesus, you can't become the children of or the disciples. So in order to be the true disciples of Jesus, what should we do? So we have in chapter 3 verse 12. So Jesus is choosing them to be with him, and to be sent out to proclaim the gospel. So first of all, in order to imbibe and assimilate the mystery of the cross, the the first and foremost, we have to be with him. So we have to meditate over the cross of Jesus. So we have to be with him. So we have to be with the Eucharistic Lord. So we have to stand near to the cross, just like the women who stood there. So be close to the cross, and you would understand the mystery of human life. You will understand the mystery of the discipleship, and you would understand the mystery of the kingdom of heaven. And this gospel was teaching the proclamation of the kingdom of heaven. So what was the proclamation of Jesus, which we find in chapter 1 verse 12 and 13? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So the kingdom of heaven is here. And how can you enter into the kingdom of heaven? By embracing the cross and the mysteries of the cross. And that is the basic teaching of the gospel of Mark.